Hello, I'm sitting here this afternoon with Martyn Downer, and we're going to talk about this magnificent Jacobite Cup, which Martyn has done a lot of research on and has really brought it to life. It's the most fantastic story, Martyn. I don't know where you want to start, but perhaps a little bit of background about you and your research, because I know you do Nelson things and lots of other things. And then perhaps just tell us a little bit about the Cup and its history.
Thanks, Tim. Yes. I specialise in researching objects mainly from the 18th and 19th century. This silver cup was given to me by the owners to research about 18 months ago. It had emerged at auction in the United States in 2018. And in itself, it's a handsome example of a George II London-made silver cup, made in 1743. But what makes it exceptional is that on one side it has a fleur-de-lis for the Prince of Wales, and on the other it has a most intriguing inscription.
Right.
And the owners wanted me to research the history of the cup because it appeared to have a connection to Prince Charles Edward Stuart, Bonnie Prince Charlie, and we needed to understand it further. So I disappeared into the libraries and I disappeared into the Royal Archives, and gradually over many months, a most remarkable story connected to this cup emerged.
Right.
Essentially, to rewind to the Jacobite rebellion in 1745, the Jacobites launched their rebellion. They got as far as Derby in England before they turned back to Scotland, pursued by the British Army. And eventually, of course, famously, they met the end of the rebellion at the Battle of Culloden in 1746. Following the battle, the leader of the Jacobite rebellion, Prince Charles Edward Stuart, the Jacobite Prince of Wales, who was a romantic figure, who was seeking to restore to the British throne his father, James, who was currently in exile in Italy. He, together with his most trusted officers, then went on the run after Culloden. His baggage train, some of it was captured by the British Army at Culloden, others were returned to his Jacobite followers.
Right.
2 weeks after the defeat of the Jacobites at Culloden, 2 French men of war appear on the west coast of Scotland, loaded with casks of gold coins, louis d'or, French gold coins, which Louis XV had sent weeks earlier in the hopes of supporting the rebellion, which clearly was in the French interest that it should succeed. The French had financed much of the Jacobite rebellion. And if you are familiar with the Netflix series Outlander, you will see the whole colourful story of how the rebellion was funded by the French. However, these French men of war...
Nothing changes.
Nothing changed. The men of war landed too late, arrived too late. The rebellion had already collapsed. The Jacobites were scattered across Scotland, many in hiding, Bonnie Prince Charlie himself on the run. However, the gold coin that the ships carried was still landed on the west coast of Scotland and entrusted to a handful of Highlanders who very quickly buried it near a loch on the west coast of Scotland, Loch Arkaig.
This is where this weird myth of metal detectorists looking for treasure comes from. Yes,
absolutely. Okay. So since that day, that story is well recorded.
Right.
And to this day, detectorists and treasure hunters go to Loch Arkaig in the hope of recovering this mythical lost gold of the Jacobites.
And you're now going to ruin that completely.
And I'm now going to ruin the story. Or in fact make the story more exciting still. Because this cup, as I chipped away at its history, revealed a more extraordinary story. Far from the gold lying untouched in Loch Arkaig, Bonnie Prince Charlie eventually escapes to France. In fact, he is embarked on a French ship very near the place where the gold had been landed in 1746, and soon after. He escaped to France, where he was badly received by the French king, having failed in his rebellion. And over the ensuing months and then years, he descended into some poverty. So he obviously sought to recover what he'd left behind during the failed rebellion.
Right.
Principally and primarily the gold that the king had sent him. So the prince, from exile in France, sent a coded letter to a Jacobite secret agent known as Major Kennedy, although we're not sure what his real name was. Major Kennedy, who was a very trusted bodyguard for the prince and had been at Culloden, had remained behind in England after the battle to manage and operate the Jacobite Secret Service, which was quite extensive across the whole British Isles.
And these were Catholics?
Not necessarily Catholics, no. The Jacobites are perceived today as primarily Catholic, and they were, the majority were Catholic because the king they wished to restore was, of course, Catholic. But there were many reasons why people would support the Jacobite cause: political, religious, financial. So there were different vested interests that people supported the Jacobites.
So it's not just a Scottish thing, there were Jacobites.
And it certainly wasn't just a Scottish thing.
Right.
And that, again, is today we perceive it as predominantly a Jacobite project or operation, a Scottish operation. But in fact, the Jacobites had widespread sympathies in England and in London, and in particular in the city of London. And so there was a widespread sympathy for the cause, even after the collapse of the 45 rebellion.
OK, sorry, I didn't mean to disturb your story.
No, it's important, actually, because this makes sense of the cup. And so Major Kennedy, the Jacobite secret agent, sought somebody to recover the gold for the prince in exile. And he was familiar with someone called Charles Selby. Charles Selby was a Catholic, but he was a landowner in Northumberland, and his farmhouse and his estate was about 80 miles from the Scottish border.
Right.
Charles Selby was a Jacobite sympathiser and possibly a Freemason who communicated with Major Newton through Freemasonry contacts. His name, Charles, of course, indicates his connection to the Stuarts and his sympathy for the Stuart cause after Charles I had been executed. His own father had been out in the earlier 1715 rebellion, uprising, and had been imprisoned. So he had a natural sympathy for the 45. And so when Major Kennedy approached Selby, again using coded contacts, he immediately agreed to try and set up an operation to move the gold from its hiding place at Loch Arkaig on the west coast down to London,
right,
where it could be converted to a note to send to.
Meantime, I'm guessing that the English soldiers were rampaging all over that sort of area.
Absolutely, it was an extremely dangerous time to indicate any support for the Jacobites.
Yeah.
Many of the Jacobite leaders, such as Lord Lovat, Lord Balmerino, were still in the Tower of London awaiting execution. Many executions were still being undertaken. It was an extremely treacherous time to show any connection to the Jacobites.
Okay.
So Selby was taking his life literally in his hands by agreeing to do this and to try and set up some sort of operation to get the gold down. So Selby made contact with someone called Cluny Macpherson, Ewan Macpherson of Cluny, who was the chief of the Macpherson clan and had been a colonel in the Jacobite army during the rebellion. Macpherson, following the failure of the 1745 rebellion, had gone into hiding with many of his friends and was living in Scotland in a highland hideaway made of branches, literally a sort of cave, known as Cluny's Cage, famously, and still is a place of pilgrimage for Jacobite tourists. Cluny Macpherson, however, was very well connected to the Jacobite Secret Service. He'd also been entrusted by the prince from exile to take charge of the prince's belongings in France, including the gold and any baggage that the prince left behind. So Cluny Macpherson knew where the gold was, and having made contact with him, Charles Selby engaged Cluny's brother-in-law, another member of the Macpherson clan, to run the operation from Scotland. All this, the narrative of the gold is an extraordinary hidden story which has been tucked away in the Royal Archives at Windsor. And it's only when I was investigating this cup that these extraordinary pieces fell into place.
How do you know where to look?
Well, the Royal Archives hold the Stuart papers, even though, of course, the Stuarts lost the throne hundreds of years ago. The British royal family purchased the Stuart papers, and they are available to researchers. And it was the obvious and first place to look for a connection to Selby. So Macpherson set up some Highlanders to go and recover the gold from the lock and to move it some 300 miles down, 250 miles down to Northumberland, to Selby's farmhouse, where Selby secreted it at home, at his premises. And then Selby, together with a trusted servant, rode it the next 200 and something miles down to London, to the City of London, where it was received by Jacobite bankers operating in clandestine in the City of London. So Selby rode the gold himself, probably at very high peril, down to London. In the correspondence at Windsor, there are letters between Selby and Major Kennedy explaining how this would work. And they use codes for the gold. They never mention gold. They talk of moving the cattle or moving horses. So if their correspondence was intercepted by the Redcoats, the British, they would not possibly be alerted to the movement of this hoard of gold.
You get terribly excited when you find...
Well,
there's this cup which has an inscription.
Yes.
And then suddenly you're bringing it to life. And you're sitting in the archives, and then you suddenly find all these...
Yes, I mean, I've worked on many, many exciting things. I've been very fortunate to work on very many exciting objects over my career. Many connected to Admiral Lord Nelson, who's a particular area of speciality for me. But I have to say, Tim, that I've never handled an object which has restored to a very well-known story such an extraordinary and new twist.
Yeah.
So it's been thrilling. So the operation was successful. They did it. The gold was converted to notes sent to the prince in exile. In the correspondence at Windsor, there's a letter from Selby refusing any payment for undertaking this highly perilous journey with the gold. Whereas, as became clear in accounting for the gold, much of the gold had already been siphoned off by interests in Scotland, possibly to support another rebellion, to sustain the Highlanders, who were under extreme duress at that time. And so a lot of the gold had already filtered off. But Selby himself refused. Are you being
benevolent then, or was it just stolen?
Yes, some of it was pinched, or a lot of it was pinched or pilfered.
Yeah.
But undoubtedly. But Selby was a romantic, and he was imbued by great loyalty and duty. He refused payment, and as now became clear, as this cup makes clear, instead of a payment, he was rewarded with a silver cup. So the cup itself was made in London in 1743 by a very distinguished silversmith called Paul Crespin, who was one of the Huguenot smiths who come across from France with his family. He made silver for the British royal family, so it's ironic that he made a cup that was then presented probably by an English Jacobite sympathiser to the Jacobite Prince of Wales, Prince Charles Edward Stuart. When Bonnie Prince Charles landed in Scotland ahead of the rebellion, he landed with only a very small number of followers and gradually, or very rapidly, built up an army. But as he did so, he was very, very keen to project the status of a monarch, or to project to his followers that here I am, I'm going to live like my status demands.
Right.
So by giving a cup such as this to the prince, the sympathiser was enabling the prince to dine. He held court at Holyrood Palace in Edinburgh for several weeks. Wherever the prince went, even though he was engaged in a military campaign, he wished to give the impression of a court on the move.
So this cup, you believe, is part of his original
Absolutely.
baggage train?
Completely. So this would have been part of a large
So he may have touched the cup.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It was part of a large collection of plate, as they called silver, that the prince would have travelled with and used at table, surrounded by his followers, by his military officers, by sympathisers, in the manner that the British royal family in London were also doing, because he wanted to say that by exchanging the Hanoverians for us, the Stuarts, or returning the Stuarts, our status is as grand as it always was. At the Battle of Culloden, which was a chaotic and disastrous defeat for the Jacobites, in the chaotic aftermath of the battle, Bonnie Prince Charlie had to flee the battlefield with only a small retinue of bodyguards. His baggage train and his luggage and his plate was abandoned on the battlefield. Some of it was captured by the British Army, including a silver canteen, a campaign canteen, which is now in the National Museum of Scotland, and a few other objects such as weapons. This cup, however, together with other silver, was recovered from the battlefield by that man, Cluny Macpherson. And he took charge of the silver on behalf of the prince and then spent several months on the run, carting the silver around at great peril and risk and difficulty. And in fact, he writes a letter to the prince saying it's extremely difficult. I mean, I'm dragging this silver around and we keep hiding it. So it becomes clear that by way of thanks for running this operation, Selby was rewarded with a fine example of the prince's royal silver.
Which he must have been thrilled about.
Which he was absolutely, no doubt, overwhelmed by. And the cup itself, a cup in that period, was a very symbolic and meaningful object, used at table to share drink,
right,
passed from hand to hand. And so one can absolutely envisage this being used and drunk from by the prince before passing it to one of his supporters. And in doing so, it's a very meaningful gesture of tying followers together. So it was so in choosing this particular object, it's rewarding Selby for his very great duty to the prince in exile. Selby himself, of course, could never talk about his involvement in this operation without risking his life and his family's life and his estate's. However, he was, we now know, painted holding the cup. We know that because when I was researching the cup, there's no mention of it in the official histories of the Jacobites. The gold in the official history of the Jacobites still appears to be at Loch-Arkaig.
Yes.
None of this story has been revealed. But I did run across a reference from a book published in 1975 to a local Northumbrian historian who'd been to see someone in Edinburgh and had seen the cup. She mentioned seeing the cup, still in the family of the Selbys, together with a portrait of Charles Selby, the original recipient, displaying the cup. So I found that reference, but all I had was a cup. So I then spent a long time in the National Archives at Kew, tracing the Selby family lines. And as you can imagine, over 250, 60, 80 years, descendants multiply very quickly into hundreds of people, if not thousands of people. But I identified a possible senior descendant of Charles Selby, not that they shared the Selby name today, and in contacting them, discovered the portrait.
Were they surprised when
they were amazed? Yes, and the portrait itself is not a particularly distinguished portrait. It's a portrait from the mid-18th century, of course, showing Charles Selby holding this cup very proudly, and indicates the attachment he has to the cup, but also the extreme security of not displaying. So the fleur-de-lis on it, there's no Jacobite symbolism to it. But the fact that he was painted with it and that we now have the cup really caps an extraordinary story of adventure and detection. Selby's own son, when Selby received the cup, it was engraved with the Jacobite fleur-de-lis for Bonnie Prince Charlie, Jacobite Prince of Wales. It's the same device that appears on the silver canteen, which we know was recovered from Culloden. Later, by the 1830s, it had been engraved with an inscription relating the story of the services that Charles Selby, still undefined, but the services that Charles Selby had offered.
By the family.
By the family.
Yeah.
Remarkably, Charles Selby's son was still alive in the 1830s. He was born in 1756. And he obviously would have learned the story on his father's knee, would have known the cup, would have known the portrait. And by the 1830s, the Jacobite rebellion, which was then almost a century before, was then perceived in a kind of romantic manner. Walter Scott had written his novels, there was great interest in Scotland, and the Jacobites were now, and Bonnie Prince Charlie began the process of being transformed from this sort of treacherous rebel into this highly romanticised figure, over to the sea to sky, dressed as a female serving maid, and so forth. So Charles Selby's son felt able to engrave on the cup how the cup had been received by his father from Prince Charles Edward Stuart. But then the cup remained in the family until it was sold in the 1990s and then subsequently emerged in America. So it's been lost to history, but in discovering it and in taking the time to research it fully, it has recovered this extraordinary story of Jacobite secret agents, buried gold, the prince's silver. So for me personally, it's been a really wonderful opportunity and a great thrill to be involved in.
But just to close the two lines of provenance down, the portrait still exists.
Yes.
And did you not call someone and ask them, and they said...
Absolutely.
Oh,
so,
I mean, that's quite an interesting...
Yeah, so having identified the most likely owner of the family portrait, I mean, it really was needle in a haystack time, because it, could be, may not even still survive. But I called them and hit the jackpot straight away. They still owned the portrait. The family still had the portrait. A previous member of the family had sold the cup, but not the portrait. The portrait had been preserved, but the cup, as a precious and perhaps vulnerable object, had been sold. And so they became separated for the first time in over 250 years. And so in seeing the portrait and now having the cup is a really remarkable reunion and wonderful historical serendipity that they should emerge together.
Yes. Yeah. We spend a little bit of time thinking about values and things, which is very difficult with anything that's Jacobite because it is scarce. This is particularly scarce. It's a personal object from his baggage train. It involves a wonderful myth that you've now completely blown apart. So all those tourist facilities up near the loch are not going to be very happy with you.
Still very beautiful, though.
We think that it's a likely figure for this cup is about 150-ish thousand, which sounds a lot, but with the history, and there aren't many objects that you can buy that he touched from his baggage train and that have all this story attached to it.
I mean, there's still an extraordinary interest in the Jacobites and in the two rebellions and in Prince Charles Edward Stuart. And objects, as you know, appear at auction, but they're predominantly early souvenirs or objects made for Jacobite followers to treasure.
Yeah.
Objects belonging to the prince himself are exceptionally rare and hardly ever appear on the market. The silver canteen, which I mentioned, which was recovered from Culloden after the battle, was retained by the family of one of the British officers at the battle, and then in the 1980s was sold to the National Museum of Scotland. And that's a comparable object to this, and was sold for the equivalent today of about 400,000.
Right.
After a public appeal. And this object is comparable to that, but actually in many ways, of course, has a more extraordinary story because it changes the biography of the prince and changes the narrative of the failed rebellion.
So. I mean, I know originally we wanted to display the cup in an exhibition with all the supporting documents, but that isn't possible because of COVID. Hopefully, at some point, we will be able to display it better so that people can come and have a look at it.
I mean, it's a highly engaging object because of all the different elements to it. It's a fine example of a cup,
right,
which then unpacks into this extraordinary adventure story and is redolent of history, having been touched by one of the most famous individuals from our...
Well, he may have drunk out of it as well,
I'm almost certain he would have drunk from it at table, possibly at Holyrood. Almost all his silver collections have been dispersed and lost, except those that for some reason slipped away and have been preserved in families such as this. So it's a wonderful recovered object.